Why is it important to be aware of the situation we have? I did a review for Hans's book and John Funn's book, called Obama's Enforcer, and I started the review thusly. I said, a catalog of government lawlessness is more discomforting to contemplate when the catalog is contemporary. We're all familiar with tales of mischief, corruption, and abuse of power from other ages and in other places. We call it history. But the new book, Obama's Enforcer by Fund and von Spakovsky, documents the rank lawlessness that has saturated Eric Holder's Justice Department and thus the Obama presidency. Folks, this is a frightening state of affairs for people who believe in the rule of law and limited government. If you will, it's like a libertarian's worst nightmare coming true. The power to fundamentally transform the United States rests in the Justice Department. Your issue might be energy, your issue might be taxes, your issue might be something else, but all of those different agencies of federal government answer to DOJ. Rock beats scissors. DOJ beats everybody else. So if you're trying to alter how the federal government deals with people, the policies, the regulations, everything flows out of DOJ. Now, when I heard some of the stories you just heard, I kept reminiscing about when I was there. Remember, I was there during the Bush years, I was there during the Obama years. And so I saw this up close. And let me share sort of an analogy of how this used to work. I did voting law, that's all I did. During the Bush years, we viewed law as like a fence. The law said you must be inside these boundaries. When I did redistricting litigation to create minority-majority districts, we followed this incredibly boring regimen called Thornburg v. Jingles. You had Jingles 1, Jingles 2, Jingles 3, and the 7 Senate factors. And you had to establish these different rules because the Supreme Court said so. This was the fence. The Justice Department would not sue a defendant unless you satisfied all of the elements. After the inauguration, something amazing happened. You saw it in real time. The law was no longer a confining force. The law was no longer a fence. It was a suggestion. And I will never forget, in 2009, the political appointees at the Justice Department conjuring up what was called a brown bag lunch, where all of the employees in the voting session got together and tried to cook up ways around a recent Supreme Court decision called Bartlett v. Strickland that I had worked on involving the same elements I just talked about, Jingles 1, Jingles 2, Jingles 3. And they could not handle the idea that you had to prove that a potential district required 50% African American or minority population to bring a lawsuit. They're like, how do we get around this case? How do we find a way around the law rather than stay within the law? I couldn't believe my ears. The law was no longer a fence. It was a mere suggestion on the way to a progressive goal. And this fundamental difference in philosophy was on display without any apologies. They were there to fundamentally transform how you do things. And that's why they got elected, and that's exactly what they did. Now, in Obama's Enforcer, there's case after case after case where this lawlessness is on display. Hans didn't mention much about it except in Gibson, but ENRD, Environmental Natural Resources Division, is the division in justice in charge of environmental issues. He talks in the book about how ENRD, the lawyers at ENRD, are bringing these environmental cases, these wetland cases, these anti-property cases, anti-business cases, and losing on a theory over and over and over and over again. Now, when I went to law school, maybe University of South Carolina, we don't do everything they do in the other law schools, but when I went to law school at USC, they taught us, when you lose on a theory repeatedly, when you lose on this particular idea, when the court rules against you, you don't keep arguing the same thing. But not at this Justice Department. The law is a mere suggestion. It's not a fence. Take a look at South Carolina. They passed a voter ID law. Well, Eric Holder objected to it under the Voting Rights Act. We used to be able to do that. Now we can't do that anymore, thanks to the Supreme Court. And the Justice Department sued South Carolina, blocked voter ID, so South Carolina sued the Justice Department to get it approved. It cost South Carolina taxpayers $3.5 million to prove Eric Holder wrong because of the law being a suggestion, not a fence. Hans mentioned the attorney who still works at the Justice Department who committed perjury. I know you've heard it once before, but I have to say it again. The employee who works at the Justice Department committed perjury. She's still getting her paycheck, and she's still popular for what she did. How do you deal with that? How do you get your head around that? Now, Hans closed on a note of pessimism, and let me sort of echo that. I am afraid that the institutional culture that's being created will be impossible to rein in the future. The ministerial state has sort of outpaced the ability for the political branches to rein it in. The ministerial state has gotten so big, so powerful, so unrestrained that the Constitution leaves us very few answers. Take a look at what's happening now. You have Republicans in Congress even unwilling to use the constitutional weaponry they have. For example, the power of the purse. Not one penny gets spent for any of this outlandish Gibson guitar investigation, voter ID attacks. Not one penny gets spent unless the House Republicans say so. So the power of the purse exists for this moment when we have an out-of-control government. What about things such as the impeachment of lesser officials? Now, you might think you impeach the president. No, the Constitution allows the impeachment of lesser federal officials. How about officials we don't even know the names of? So the administration will not spend political capital to defend them. If you want to affect policy, impeach the lawless lesser officials. So I'm afraid that there are very few tools left in the Constitution that are effective against the Holder style of justice. This is not your grandfather's Democratic Party anymore. This is a muscular, ideological, leftist, statist Democratic Party that is controlling the Justice Department. It is not the Bill Clinton Justice Department. It's not the Carter Justice Department. It's certainly not the Johnson Justice Department. This is a militant, ideologically driven DOJ that is seeking to transform all components of American life, whether it's disability law, election law, which is my specialty, housing law, all the components of the Civil Rights Division. You could see it in immigration. What law? Let's just not enforce it. And so there's different ways they're going about achieving this objective. In closing, let me note, this isn't an academic exercise either, folks. This is not something that we can gaze at from afar, because while it might be quirky and interesting to talk about some of these things and then move on to something else, this is something that is corrosive to the very architecture of liberty. This is something that undermines the very structures the founders created to preserve domestic tranquility, to preserve equality before the law. And I'm afraid that there is a gathering storm developing, and right now the epicenter of it is down at 900 Pennsylvania Avenue.